And what if I told you that death doesn't exist? Carlos Méndez, a retired firefighter, discovered this when his heart stopped in 1995. In that moment, he was ripped from his body and taken to a dimension where time, fear, and human limitations did not exist. Beings of light revealed a shocking secret. Everything we believe to be real is an illusion, and death is merely the beginning of something unimaginable. Why were they forced to bring him back? This isn't a theory or a tale. It is the real experience of a man who was on the other side and lived to tell the tale. If you've ever felt that there's something more, this will leave you speechless. Hello, everyone. My name is Carlos Méndez. I'm a retired firefighter, and I live on the central coast of Mexico. Today, I want to share with you an experience that changed my life forever. It was in 1995, during one of my shifts in service, when I had a near-death experience that showed me something I will never forget. Back then, I didn't talk about it with anyone. I didn't know how to explain it or even process it. More than 15 years passed before I finally dared to seek answers, and what I discovered took me on a fascinating journey through ancient knowledge, shamans, and a completely new understanding of life, death, and what lies beyond. But it all started that day in 1995. I was on duty at Fire Station number 6 in a small town near the coast. At that time, there was a flu epidemic affecting the entire region. Hospitals were crowded, and we as an emergency team were responding to call after call. It was during one of those calls that everything changed. We received a report about a woman who needed urgent medical help. When we arrived at her house, we found her in her room, with the curtains drawn and the air thick. She was very ill, struggling to breathe. Without thinking twice, I approached to place an oxygen mask on her. At that moment, she exhaled sharply, and without realizing it, I inhaled some of that air. 2 days later, I began to feel extremely unwell. I had never been so sick in my life. I had a high fever, vomiting, and a weakness that kept me from even getting out of bed. I remember looking in the mirror and seeing a pale, emaciated skeleton. My heart was beating once an hour, and when I tried to take my pulse, I felt nothing. I knew my blood pressure was through the floor. My family called for an ambulance, and they rushed me to the nearest hospital. The place was full of people with symptoms similar to mine. The doctor in charge attended to all of us quickly, prescribing medications for pain and nausea. I didn't feel intense pain, but they gave me a strong painkiller, similar to morphine, and something for the nausea. Within seconds, everything went black. My wife later told me that my eyes rolled back, and I fell unconscious on the bed. What happened next is hard to put into words, but I will try. Suddenly, I found myself outside my body. It was as if I had been freed from an oppressive, hot prison. I felt light, free, and surrounded by a sense of peace I had never experienced before. Around me were what I can only describe as giant stars of vibrant colors, shining with a warm, welcoming light. They weren't stars like the ones we see in the sky, but something more, as if they were beings of pure energy. I flew through that space. It was as if someone had poured honey over my mind, and that sweetness spread throughout my entire being. Every cell in my body vibrated with an energy that I cannot compare to anything in this world. In that moment, I realized something incredible. Everything I thought I was doing, everything I thought was important in my life, was nothing more than an illusion. My identity, my worries, my relationships, all seemed so insignificant compared to what I was experiencing. As I flew, those beings of light, those stars, conveyed to me a sense of unconditional love. It was as if I was coming home after a long journey. I felt accepted, loved, and part of something much greater than myself. But then, something changed. Suddenly, I landed in a place that felt solid, real. It was like a room with dim lighting tables and equipment I didn't recognize. In front of me, there were 3 small beings, dressed in dark robes and hoods. These beings didn't scare me. On the contrary, they had a playful and joyful energy. Their faces were partially covered, but I could see their smiles and bright eyes. They began asking me questions, laughing among themselves, as if they were sharing an inside joke. One of them turned to the others and said, "Doesn't it remind you of someone?" And they all laughed. I felt confused, but at the same time, something in me resonated with their presence. It was as if I had known them before, in another place, at another time. At that moment, another being appeared. It was tall, slender, and seemed to be made of some sort of vapor or mist. As it moved, it was like watching someone underwater, with parts of its body separating and coming back together. This being radiated such an intense, loving energy that I felt completely loved. My chest expanded, my throat tightened, and I felt I was going to burst into tears from the purity of that love. The 3 small beings continued laughing and asking questions, while the tall being observed with a calm smile. At one point, I asked him if we were going to do a life review, as I had heard happens in these experiences. He laughed a deep and resonant laugh and said to me, "Of course, where would you like to start?" I shared some stories from my life, things I had done, and decisions I had made. There were no major regrets, just a couple of moments where I wished I had acted differently. One of those was when I turned down a job as a park ranger on a remote island. My wife wanted me to accept it, to take another path. I told the being that sometimes I wondered how our life would have been if we had made that choice. He simply nodded and said, "That's enough. It's time to go back." Go back? No, I don't want to go back. I told him, "I'm happy here with you." I don't want to return to that world. But the tall being just smiled and said, "You have things to do. You must go back." The 3 small beings disappeared as if they had been called to another part of that place. The tall being approached me, and I felt the space around me beginning to fade away. It was as if I were changing channels, moving from one frequency to another. Before I could protest further, I felt a drop like I was quickly descending. The tall being faded away, and I plunged into darkness just before returning to my body. I passed through a place that terrified me. It was a cold, lonely, and desolate space. I don't want to go into too many details, but it's a place I want to stay as far away from as possible. Finally, I returned to my body. Hours later, I woke up in the hospital, connected to machines monitoring my vital signs. My blood pressure began to rise slowly, and the nurses came over to ensure I was stable. One of them told me, "You were very close, but you managed to come back." I felt sad, not because I was sick, but because I had experienced something so beautiful and now had to return to reality. But over time, that sadness transformed into a deep gratitude. Death is not something to be feared. It's a return home, a reunion with something much greater than us. Since then, I have shared my story with those who have lost loved ones. I tell them that they are not lost. They are in a place of love and peace. And although we miss their physical presence, they are always with us in another frequency, in another dimension. This experience taught me that life is a journey and that death is just the beginning of something much grander. So if you ever wonder what's beyond, remember this: there is nothing to fear. Guides us, and we are always connected. Thank you for listening to my story. After waking up in the hospital, I spent several days processing what I had lived through. Though I was physically recovering, my mind was elsewhere. I remembered every detail of that journey, every sensation, every word I had exchanged with those beings. I knew that what I had experienced was not a dream or an hallucination. It was real, more real than anything I had ever lived before. My wife noticed that something in me had changed. I seemed calmer, more reflective. One day, while we were sitting in the garden of our home, I decided to tell her everything. I spoke of the stars, the beings of light of that place, where everything was love and peace. She listened to me in silence, tears in her eyes. When I finished, she hugged me and said, "Carlos, this is a gift." Not everyone has the chance to see what you have seen, but not everything was easy. As I shared my story with friends and colleagues, I noticed some didn't know how to react. Some told me it was the effect of medication, while others simply changed the subject. A coworker even warned me, "Hey, Carlos, people are starting to talk. Maybe you should keep this to yourself." That statement hit me hard. How could something so beautiful and revealing be misunderstood? For years, I stayed silent. I focused on my work, my family, my daily life. But that experience never left me. It was like a light that was always there, reminding me that there is something more, something beyond what we can see and touch. It was after my retirement in 2010 that I decided to delve deeper into what I had experienced. I began reading about near-death experiences, about shamans, and ancient traditions that spoke of parallel dimensions and alternate realities. I discovered that many cultures, from Native Americans to ancient Egyptians, had knowledge of the afterlife that resonated with what I had experienced. One of the things that impacted me the most was learning that, according to these traditions, our reality is just one of many. It's like we're tuned into a specific frequency, but there are infinite frequencies around us, each with its own reality. Those beings I saw, those places I visited, existed in one of those frequencies, and when we die, we simply change the channel. I also understood why that dark and lonely place had scared me so much. According to what I learned, it's a space where some souls become trapped, clinging to their fears, guilt, or regrets. It's a reminder that in life, go of what weighs us down, forgive, and live with love, because in the end, it's love that guides us toward the light. Over time, I began to share my story again, but this time with a purpose. I wanted people to know that death is not the end, that our loved ones are not gone forever, and that there is a reason behind everything we experience. Every time someone who had lost a loved one came to me, I told them, they are not lost. They have just changed frequency. And if you listen with your heart, you can still feel their presence. Today, after all these years, my perspective on life and death has completely changed. I no longer fear what may come next, because I know there is no next in the way many people think. Death is not an end, but a transition, a step towards something greater and more beautiful. That experience taught me that we are so much more than our bodies, our daily worries, and the limitations of this world. Sometimes, when I look up at the night sky, I remember those colorful stars that surrounded me during my experience. I wonder if they are there on some other frequency waiting for me. And while I know my time here is not over yet, I feel a deep peace in knowing that when the time comes, I will be going home. I've had the opportunity to talk to many people who have gone through similar experiences. Each story is unique, but they all share something in common: the feeling of unconditional love, of unity with something greater. Some have seen tunnels of light, others have spoken with loved ones who have passed on, and others, like me, have interacted with beings of light who conveyed deep messages. The most fascinating thing is that despite cultural or religious differences, all these experiences point to the same thing. There is an afterlife, and it is a place of love, peace, and understanding. It doesn't matter if we call it heaven, nirvana, or simply another dimension. The important thing is that it is there waiting for us, reminding us that we are never alone. I've also learned that this life, with all its challenges and difficulties, is an opportunity to grow. Decisions I made, even those that once made me. Doubt, like the ranger job I turned down, were part of my path. And though I sometimes wonder how my life would have been had I chosen differently, I know that everything has a purpose, things to do, and that's true. We all have a purpose here, whether big or small. We may not always understand it, but each experience, each encounter, each moment of pain or joy brings us a little closer to understanding who we are and why we are here. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from my story, it's this: do not fear death, but do not neglect life either. Live with love, with gratitude, and with the certainty that there is something beyond what we can see. And when the time comes to cross over to the other side, it will not be a goodbye, but a see you soon. Thank you for allowing me to share my experience with you. I hope in some way it has touched your heart and given you a bit of peace. Remember, we are always connected in this life and the next. If this story impacted you as much as it did me, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss videos like this. Leave us a like if you believe life is more than what we see, and share in the comments what you think about these experiences. And don't ghost yet.